He started as the idealistic son who wanted to save his club from violence. He ended as the architect of his own family's destruction, leaving a trail of bodies and broken lives in his wake. Jax Teller didn't just become a villain. He became something far more terrifying. A man who convinced himself that every terrible choice was justified, right up until the moment he drove his father's motorcycle into a semi-truck at 90 miles per hour. But here's the disturbing truth that makes Sons of Anarchy more than just another crime drama. Jax's descent into darkness wasn't the result of one bad decision or a sudden moral collapse. It was a masterclass in self-deception, cognitive dissonance, and the psychological mechanisms that allow good people to commit monstrous acts while still believing they're the hero of their own story. Today, we're diving deep into the dark psychology of Jax Teller. And by the end, you might recognize some of these patterns in yourself. Let's start at the beginning, because Jax's psychological unraveling was built on a foundation that seemed noble. When we first meet Jax Teller, he's different from the other members of Sam Crow. He reads, he questions, he dreams of something better. He discovers his father's manuscript, a vision for the club that prioritized brotherhood and freedom over guns and violence. This is where the first psychological trap snaps shut: the hero complex. Jax doesn't just want to change the club, he needs to. It becomes central to his identity, his sense of purpose, his reason for existing. And here's where the psychology gets dark. When your entire self-worth is tied to being the savior, you'll do anything to maintain that narrative, even when the evidence screams that you're making things worse. Psychologists call this pathological altruism, when the desire to help becomes so consuming that it actually causes harm. Jax convinces himself that he's protecting his club, his family, his sons. But with each season, the body count rises, and the people he claims to love suffer more and more. The truly disturbing part? He never stops believing he's the good guy. Now, you might be thinking, but Jax does terrible things. How does he justify it? And that's exactly the question that reveals his darkest psychological mechanism: the rationalization cycle. Every time Jax commits an act of violence, every time he lies, manipulates, or destroys someone's life, his brain immediately goes to work constructing a justification. Someone threatened his family. He had no choice. It was them or us. He did it for his sons. This is moral disengagement in action, the psychological process that allows people to commit acts that violate their own moral standards while avoiding the guilt and shame that should follow. The psychologist Albert Bandura identified this as one of the most dangerous aspects of human psychology, because it's not just psychopaths who use it. It's all of us, in smaller ways. But in Jax, we see it weaponized. Watch how the pattern evolves. In early seasons, Jax shows genuine remorse after violence. He struggles with the weight of his decisions. But by season 7, he's orchestrating murders with the emotional investment of someone ordering coffee. The rationalization has become so automatic, so deeply embedded, that he doesn't even recognize his own moral erosion. This is what psychologists call moral habituation. The more you do something wrong, the easier it becomes, until eventually, your conscience stops even showing up to the fight. But here's where Jax's psychology gets even darker. He doesn't just rationalize his actions, he romanticizes his suffering. Throughout the series, Jax wears his pain like armor. He's haunted by his father's death, burdened by leadership, tormented by impossible choices. And there's a seductive psychology at play here, the martyr complex. When you frame yourself as someone who suffers for others, it does two things to your brain. First, it elevates your sense of moral superiority. You're not just another criminal. You're someone making hard sacrifices that others couldn't handle. Second, it gives you permission to hurt others, because in your mind, you're hurting too. You've earned the right to inflict pain because you've endured so much. This is why Jax can murder a man with his bare hands and still see himself as fundamentally different from the violence he commits. He's not a monster. He's a victim forced into monstrous circumstances. The psychology is insidious because there's a kernel of truth to it. Jax has suffered genuine trauma and loss, but he weaponizes that suffering to justify increasingly indefensible actions. One of the most psychologically fascinating aspects of Jax's character is his relationship with control, or more accurately, his illusion of it. Jax operates under the delusion that he's orchestrating events, that he's the strategic mastermind keeping chaos at bay. In reality, he's in a perpetual state of reactive crisis management, lurching from one disaster to the next, each one largely of his own making. This speaks to a fundamental psychological phenomenon, the control fallacy. When faced with complex, chaotic situations, our brains desperately want to believe we're in control, even when we're not. For Jax, maintaining this illusion is essential to his identity. To admit that he's not in control would be to admit that all the violence, all the death, all the suffering has been for nothing. So instead, he doubles down. He makes more aggressive plays, takes bigger risks, hurts more people, all while telling himself he's one move away from finally having it all under control. It's the psychology of the gambler who's convinced the next bet will win back everything they've lost. The tragedy is that Jax never seems to recognize the pattern. Even in the final season, when everything he loves has been destroyed, he's still making plans, still believing he can engineer the perfect ending. Let's talk about Jax's relationships, because this is where his dark psychology becomes most visible. Jax doesn't just love people. He consumes them, destroys them, and convinces himself it's devotion. Look at his relationship with Tara. He claims to love her, to want a better life for her and their sons. But every choice he makes pulls her deeper into the violence and chaos. When she tries to leave, he sees it as betrayal. When she stays, he exposes her to danger. The relationship becomes a trauma bond, a psychological attachment forged through cycles of intensity, danger, and emotional extremes. Trauma bonds are incredibly powerful because they hijack our neurological reward systems. The brain gets addicted to the intensity, mistaking the chemical cocktail of fear, relief, and passion for love. Jax and Tara's relationship isn't healthy devotion. It's mutual psychological destruction dressed up as romance. And Jax does the same thing with the club. He claims to love his brothers, but he manipulates them, lies to them, and leads them into increasingly dangerous situations. His love is possessive and destructive. He can't let go because these relationships are where he derives his sense of identity and worth. At the heart of Jax's psychological darkness is something deeply tragic. His relationship with his father, or more accurately, with the ghost of his father. Jax's entire journey is an attempt to reconcile with a man he never really knew, guided by writings that may have been lies, trying to fulfill a legacy that might be fiction. This is the father wound, the psychological impact of an absent or idealized father figure that shapes a man's entire identity. The psychology here is painfully real. Children of absent fathers often spend their entire lives trying to prove themselves worthy, seeking approval from someone who isn't there to give it. For Jax, this manifests as an obsession with his father's vision for the club, even though that vision directly contradicts the reality of what the club has become. But here's the dark twist. Jax uses his father's memory as both inspiration and excuse. The manuscript gives him a noble mission, but the trauma of his father's death gives him permission to be violent and vengeful. It's a psychological perfect storm. Idealism corrupted by rage, all focused through the lens of unresolved grief. In the final season, something shifts in Jax's psychology. He starts to see himself clearly, and it destroys him. This is one of the most psychologically realistic aspects of the series. There's a moment when the rationalization stops working, when the cognitive dissonance becomes too loud to ignore. Jax looks around and sees the wreckage. Tara dead, his mother exposed as a manipulator, his brothers dead or dying, his club in ruins, his sons motherless. And finally, he understands what we've been watching all along. He's not the hero of this story. He's the villain. But here's the truly dark psychology. This realization doesn't lead to redemption. It leads to nihilism. If Jax isn't the hero fighting to save his family, then what's the point of anything? His entire identity collapses, and rather than rebuild it, he chooses to end it. His final ride isn't tragic nobility. It's the ultimate act of selfishness disguised as sacrifice. He abandons his sons to the same life he claimed to want to save them from. He leaves his club in chaos. He escapes accountability by romanticizing his own death. Here's the uncomfortable truth that makes Jax Teller such a compelling character. We see ourselves in him, not in the murders or the mayhem, but in the psychology. How many times have you rationalized a bad decision by telling yourself you had no choice? How often have you held on to a relationship or situation that was clearly toxic because walking away would mean admitting you were wrong? Have you ever framed your own suffering as noble, as proof that you're doing something important? Jax Teller is what happens when these normal human psychological mechanisms go unchecked. When rationalization becomes reflex. When self-deception becomes identity. The dark psychology of Jax Teller isn't that he's a psychopath. It's that he's human. Deeply, tragically human. And his humanity is precisely what makes his descent into darkness so horrifying. He proves that you don't need to be evil to do terrible things. You just need to be convinced that you're the exception, that your circumstances are unique, that the normal rules don't apply to you. Jax Teller started with a vision for something better and ended by becoming exactly what he feared. His journey is a psychological autopsy of how good intentions can pave a highway to hell when combined with trauma, ego, and the infinite human capacity for self-deception. The most disturbing lesson from Jax's story isn't that people can change for the worse. It's how easily they can do it while believing they're changing for the better. Every terrible decision felt necessary in the moment. Every act of violence felt justified. Every betrayal felt like loyalty to something higher. And that's the real horror. Jax never became a monster. He always was one. He just convinced himself, and almost convinced us, that he was a hero. If this deep dive into the psychology of Jax Teller got you thinking, hit that like button and subscribe for more psychological breakdowns of your favorite characters. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think Jax could have been saved? Or was his tragic ending inevitable from the moment he picked up his father's manuscript? I'll see you in the next one.